Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Merle Massey, and I'm the coordinator for the Undergraduate Research Initiative here at the University of Saskatchewan. One of the programs that I run is SURE, the Student Undergraduate Research Experience, and I want to welcome you today. I stand on Treaty 6 territory on the homeland of the Métis, and I give my respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place. With us today, we have Liv Marken, who is the staff advisor for the University of Saskatchewan Undergraduate Research Journal, but she's also the lead for the Writing Center here at the University of Saskatchewan, and an excellent writer, and lots of experience with helping people to craft their stuff into a journal article. So I've asked Liv to come and walk us through what that looks like to write a journal article, because whether you've done it before or not, I guarantee you Liv's going to have some excellent points that will help you out today. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Liv.
Great, thanks, Merle. And thanks everybody for being here today. Please type into the chat. I put a message there, but if any of you have entered late, I don't know if you can see the message, to type into the chat, and I will try to pay attention to that. But Merle, if one is just hanging out there for too long, let me know. You can interrupt me. I get on a roll. So Merle mentioned that I'm an excellent writer. I'm not always, and still learning. And excellent writers are made, not born, and it takes practice and feedback. So one thing about publishing is you're going to get a lot of intensive feedback and revision. I know that when I was a grad student, I was terrified to submit something for publication because I somehow naively thought that was just going to get published. But what you submit is actually going to go through a pretty rigorous process. It's extremely rare for a paper to go straight to print. So you're going to go through a process, and you could submit to various journals. I'll talk a bit about the Undergraduate Research Journal on campus because I think it's a really good training ground for learning the whole process of peer-reviewed publication so that you could feel more comfortable with it once you go into the bigger, badder world of academic publishing. So we'll talk about that today. All right, so I'm going to talk today about why you should publish. You're already thinking about it, you're motivated to be here, and so we'll talk a little bit more about maybe things you haven't thought about. Oh my goodness, we have people from Germany and the United Kingdom here. That's exciting. All right, thinking probably evening there right now. We'll talk about how to choose a journal and how to prepare a manuscript for submission. Some of that really comes from my Writing Center background, where I teach students how to prioritize what to look at first when they're revising their work. And so I'm going to give you some of my finest strategies for things to look at first before you get into the nitty-gritty detail of, correcting spelling and all that kind of thing. We'll look at some higher order priorities at that first. All right, so we talked about text-heavy slides. I'm not going to read through each one of these. I think you could probably skim through them. This presentation is recorded, so you can go back and have a look as well. And I can also provide some links to some of the things that I'm talking about today, including the slides, if that's possible. Yeah, no problem, Kimmy. So gaining experience, I talked about that already. You will get a lot of feedback on your writing. So a certain amount of resilience is necessary. I know that that feedback will be very supportive and constructive if you submit it to the Undergraduate Research Journal on campus. That's our mission, is to be an educational experience and to be a platform for students to disseminate information outside the classroom. Having said that, it's outside the classroom, and so the paper that you got a 95% on still needs to be changed and shifted and improved in order to be publication worthy. So getting that feedback is actually a really positive thing to go through. Of course, you'll learn all kinds of transferable skills, not just ones that you could use for graduate studies. We have 2 cash Best Paper Prize awards every year with the Undergraduate Research Journal. And you'll be part of the larger scholarly conversation, helping to get new knowledge and original research out there to the world, so that you can be part of that process, which is really energizing and exciting. And of course, you'll be more Googleable, as my colleague Gassan says. These are some things that we surveyed authors about, and these kind of rose to the top when we surveyed authors every year of what they learned from the process, whether they got published or not. So some people go through the process to a certain point and just things aren't working out, or they decide to pull the plug. Various things can happen, and it's fine. It's pretty typical. But these are the things that they talked about as being the most valuable for them to learn. So one of them, I'll just highlight a couple. One of them is how to write for a public audience. So now you're writing in a multidisciplinary journal, you are taking information and doing something really important for academics to do, which is to translate that knowledge to a wider audience so that outside people can actually understand why it is important that you've done what you've done or said what you've said. And of course, some of the writing process stuff, these are some of the finer details around the writing process and how to write well. So you're going to learn a lot. It's quite an intensive learning experience, and it's great preparation for grad school, for the next year that you're going into, for professional life in any kind of situation. Here are a few quotations from former authors. One said that the comments from the reviewer had really benefited the paper in terms of its readability and the paper's usefulness. So the ability for the reader to actually make something of that information and do something. I have a question. Do you have to be affiliated with a university to publish peer-reviewed articles? If you are coming from, if you are at the University of Saskatchewan and you are a current student or you have graduated from an undergraduate degree in the last 2 years, you're eligible to submit a paper to the undergraduate research journal at the University of Saskatchewan. There are many, many other undergraduate journals out there. I'll actually just show you, how do I get out of here? I will show you if you go to, I'll provide the link for this, the Council on Undergraduate Research has a really comprehensive list of student journals. So some of them are graduate, some of them are undergraduate, some of them are open to anyone, any university student, and some of them are closed, like ours is, to the University of Saskatchewan, to one institution. So.
And I can jump in too and just say no, actually, unless anyone can, if it's a research quality journal and you want to try and write for it, you absolutely can, as long as you've got all of the things that they're looking for in a journal article and it's recent research and it's something that's new. There's always a possibility. You don't have to be involved with the university to do that. I am not a faculty member at a university. I work at administration, but at the same time, I've had things published in all kinds of journals all across the world. So no, easy answer,
yeah,
you don't.
I'm in the same situation exactly like Merle. We're professionals at a university. So we have that affiliation, which I think adds to our credibility. We have advanced degrees. That helps. But it is usually a blind peer review process when you're going into publishing. And so the editor doesn't know, or sorry, the reviewer, faculty reviewer doesn't know who you are, and vice versa. But the editors of the journal who take your submission in might be influenced by your affiliations. I think that starting with a student journal is a really good training ground for, or co-authoring. So co-authoring with a professor could be a good way to get some training in publishing and being on there.
Liv,
Yeah.
your sound is cutting out.
Oh, is it? Oh dear.
Yeah, there we go. That's better.
Oh, I wonder if I've got a new laptop. I hope I wasn't covering. Maybe I'll just lean in a little bit more.
That sounds great. Yeah, you sound good now.
Yeah. The second comment, just I'm going to kind of move on from this slide, but the second comment talks about how the feedback was so helpful. When you go into the world of publishing, it's not always going to be that way. Sometimes you can get some pretty harsh comments. You see a lot of academics on Twitter sometimes posting some of the mean things people have said to them. So just be reassured that professors get that really challenging feedback as well. And sometimes it's not phrased as constructively as it could be. So you have to be resilient and not take it too personally. Good editors of journals will kind of translate that into what the reviewer said in a softer way, taking out some meaner comments or more blunt comments and communicating it to you in a way that's more constructive. But not everybody will do that. So, all right. So I've just talked about the Council for Undergraduate Research journal listing. I would talk to, for the particular area that you're writing in, definitely talk to an expert in that area who you know, who you maybe is at your own institution, and to get some recommendations for where to publish. Liaison librarians at the libraries that you have at your institution, they're usually at most academic institutions, academic libraries, they'll have a librarian who's responsible for 2 or 3 departments, and they tend to know a fair bit about what publications are subscribed to and recommended by the faculty for a particular subject area. At the University of Saskatchewan, we have a few undergraduate journals. We may have more that I don't know about. I think there's one in law, actually. I heard something about the other day. There's one for anthropology and archaeology called Pathways. And In Medias Res is for art and poetry and fiction. And then USurge is a multidisciplinary journal. Another thing you can do is when you're doing your research, you'll notice that you're doing some lit review stuff or you're referring to other authors who've written about that. Go and see where they published. Maybe those are some journals that you could look up, look at their submission guidelines, and think about submitting to as well. All right, look for, they gave me a new laptop and it's tiny, so I'm just like not used to having so little space on the screen. All right, so when you're choosing a journal, you can narrow it down a little bit further. When you go to their websites, you can dig in a little bit more. And you want to look at the types of submissions that they will consider. USurge, for example, will consider review papers. We will look at something that we call alternative submissions, papers that aren't like what we consider your typical, Western understanding of an academic article. So we're quite flexible with different genres in that way. We accept art as well. And we can you see my husband chatting with me here? I think I'm gonna have to turn off Teams. Well, I guess
no, we're good.
Oh,
that's not showing up.
He keeps popping up and chatting with me.
No, all good.
Okay, so you might also look at and we also accept submissions of or welcome submissions of research snapshots, which are very short pieces where you may describe your research process or your research, your experimental design, or you might do a mini analysis of a particular line in one poem. So we do accept shorter pieces as well. You might also want to look at things like the journal impact factor and journal citation reports. Not all good journals, though, show these metrics. It's a little bit controversial. I would talk to a librarian for help with that in determining journal impact factor and citation reports. So this just means that the journals are perhaps more widely read and cited and credible, but not necessarily. Occasionally there can be a cost. Sometimes the cost is really high. So there are article processing fees for submitting to a journal. And sometimes, though, there are discounts available. So you can talk to a liaison librarian about that. Open access is really important. So it's important that your work is findable openly on the internet. You will be cited more. Not all open access journals are credible or reliable. Some of them are what are called predatory journals, which I'll talk about in a second. But so you want to look for open access journals to make sure that your work gets out there. And ethically, it's important that people around the world can use that knowledge and have access to that knowledge. So, libraries subscribe to many journals. Some of them, there's one in engineering at the University of Saskatchewan that's around $60,000 a year just for one journal. And so only people at the University of Saskatchewan can access that journal for that subscription while they're a student or while they work here. But once they graduate, they can't get that information. And so it's important, I think, for and a lot of people think that information be made open so that everybody can afford to find that information. So you want to, you can go to, we have a really good guide from our library that discusses open access in more detail. You can also check the directory of open access journals. Not all good open access journals are necessarily listed here, but many are. The standards for inclusion in the DOAJ are very rigorous, and some undergraduate journals are in there. So USurge is one of those journals that can be found in the DOAJ. Watch out for predatory publishing. So you might get it because you're at a university and you have a university email address. You may have even seen these predatory publishing call for papers that might have the odd misspelling, or they use 20 different fonts and they just seem a little bit off. So be very suspicious if somebody invites you to submit a paper, especially if there's a cost associated with it. So they tend not to have any editing or peer review. They appear to be legitimate open access. They charge very high fees, and they send out a lot of spam email. You also, so look up that journal if you're still not sure, and look at the quality of writing. Check with your instructor or your supervisor, because they may know more about what the legitimate journals are and which are not legitimate. And is it listed within DOAJ or Ulrich's periodicals directory? And the website should also have a statement about, it should have information or details about the scope, contact information, who is on the editorial board, what are their qualifications, can you actually find those people online at those institutions, and what is their peer review process. There's a great website called thinkchecksubmit.org where you can also find resources for and information about predatory journals. Any questions about why you should submit and that particular, and how you can submit papers?
There was a question from Kimmy. Should you ever have to pay a fee to submit to a peer-reviewed journal? And I wrote, some do, and they are still legitimate. There are costs that have been inserted into that process, which is quite problematic. If you have a supervisor, though, for your work, usually the supervisor has grants that will cover that.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and some of them can be quite high from what I've heard. I've never encountered that, but you know, you talk to some people, especially in the sciences, where that's just par for the course. That's something that happens. So I was just going to show you before we move on to preparing the topic of how to prepare your manuscript or the assignment that you got a good mark on for submission to a journal. I will just mention for the undergraduate research journal, I'll put in the chat a link to a video on how you actually submit your, quite an ugly link, but there it is, how you actually submit to the University of Saskatchewan undergraduate research journal. Okay. Every time I do this, I have to go through. Okay. So something we talk about in writing studies and writing pedagogy is the difference between hawks and locks. So higher order concerns when you're going through the revision, editing, and proofreading process, and lower order concerns. This is not to say that the column on the right includes unimportant information. It includes really important information. And of course, some of these left to right are actually interconnected, so you can't have one without the other. So if you have poor sentence structure, that is going to affect your clarity, for example. So you can see how these things are pretty hard to disentangle, but if you're going to prioritize what you look at first and what you look at last, it makes more sense to look at the higher order concerns first, rather than spending all kinds of time going through and proofreading. So looking at spelling, grammar, punctuation, accuracy, citations, only to go to higher order concerns and cut a paragraph that you just meticulously proofread. So you can be wasting a little bit of time that way. So I would recommend that you really focus less on correctness and more on the concerns that you see on the left hand of the screen, the higher order concerns. So that's really what I'm going to focus on today. For the lower order concerns, you can definitely outsource in terms of tutoring. So if you use a writing center at your institution, if you hire somebody to help you, remember that there are ethical considerations around them editing and proofreading your work. I would recommend going to Editors Canada. They have, they're trained in ethical editing of student texts. You'll get a contract. You'll get somebody who's really qualified and knows what they're doing. But I would work with the tutor because you can then learn about how to punctuate, how to cite, and how to work with different sentence types and how to structure sentences better. And then you're learning, and then you're more and more independent as you go on into the future. Oh, thanks for finding my links for me as I go through. That's great.
That's right, how you can tell I'm listening.
Yeah. So this is what's interesting is that the I don't know how interesting it is, but it's interesting to me. But the journal editors for USearch actually use something like this, a table where they go through. So the ethical concerns are the first thing they look at, then they go to the other things, and they always end with the lower order concerns. So rather than kind of swarming and doing this feeding frenzy around the entire paper, they do one at a time. So they first attend to, are there any copyright issues? Are there any conflicts of interest? So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. So for copyright, if you're using any kind of images or tables, you're reproducing any information, you want to make sure that you have copyright permissions or check whether they're Creative Commons licensed and whether or not you can use those particular images. It will save your editors and you a lot of headaches down the road. Most universities have some kind of copyright expert or copyright coordinator. We have one at the University of Saskatchewan Library, so you can always contact them if you're not sure, and they can help you out and educate you in the process. Some issues around copyright in terms of Indigenous knowledges, there's some differences and there's some additional things that you need to consider. The University of Saskatchewan has a really good Indigenous knowledges copyright law guide, and so I would recommend checking that out. You want to think about any conflict of interest. So, for example, when if you're submitting to a journal, this happens with student journals all the time, you might know the editor-in-chief. So you might want to give them a heads up, this paper's coming through, and just ask them what the process is for dealing with conflict of interest. We have a process for dealing with that takes the editors in question completely out of the process so that it's more, so that we don't have that bias. You might also think about whether you've unintentionally plagiarized. This very much comes up with paraphrasing, and we do checks on this. We do paraphrasing checks. We'll do spot checks. We'll look for inconsistent style. Most of the time, the student didn't realize they were doing it, but paraphrasing, when you do that, it can be quite easy to plagiarize. So go back to the original source that you paraphrased and make sure that it's not too close to the original. We have some very good paraphrasing workshops on our library website, and I'll make a note to send a link for that as well. So there are kind of, people always have these questions about how many words in a row and that kind of thing. So this kind of answers all of those questions. You want to make sure that you have ethics approval. We've had so many papers come through where somebody interviewed, we had one where the student had interviewed somebody in a particular religious community who they knew, and then used that in a paper for a gender studies class. But they didn't go through the whole ethics approval process of the institution because it wasn't going to be published. So it wasn't necessary for that course. Even if you anonymize don't mention them by name or by community, even if they can't be identified, you do need to have had that ethics approval. So if you're thinking, oh, this project I'm doing in this class, or this, I might end up wanting to publish. So you could talk to your professor about how to get ethics approval for what you're doing. And you also want to look at language bias. So this can be more complicated than you'd think, but I would recommend going, even if you're not using APA style, American Psychological Association citation style, they have an excellent, MLA might now too, but APA has an excellent chapter on on language bias and bias in research that is very clearly outlined and has lots of examples. And think about your co-authors. You don't want to submit a paper if you wrote it in collaboration, so you might not be able to track them down. You cannot submit without their permission, so you need to find a way to track them down to get permission to submit if you have co-authors. All right, so let's look at the big picture. So other higher order concerns. I want to think about structure, relevance, audience, who are you writing for, argumentation, logical flow, what's your main point? Are you writing or presenting information in a way that is credible, that makes you reliable, will make you listen to? And what's the story? So oftentimes we plunk information or data interpretation down onto a piece of paper, but we sort of don't contextualize it in terms of where does this fit in the existing conversation about this topic that's already published and out there. That conversation could be on Twitter. That conversation could be in academic Twitter, in peer-reviewed publications. It might be a talk that you attended by an elder. It might be in a course that you've been in. Those conversations are everywhere in university communities and outside of university communities. So kind of immerse yourself in that and think about, well, where does this actually fit in that conversation? I think that's a really important piece, especially early in the paper. Yeah, so structure, I've got a few images here. One is the balcony view, one is a bird's eye view. I think we use that kind of that statement all the time. And then one is some architecture. So there's an architecture school in South America that has informing its curriculum poetry. So they'll look at really closed form traditional verse where the rhyme is even and the line syllable lengths are even. And so something like this building would be, you know, clear repetition and patterns. But then they also look at free-form verse where that translates to the architecture in a different way. As you can imagine, you might get really interesting or something more like a Frank Gehry design that looks like a piece of crumpled paper. So I don't know if that makes sense, but think about structure in terms of repetition and how things relate to one another. Or you might think at bird's eye view, how does this paper look from above? How is it structured? How does everything interconnect? Is one section way longer than another section? Those kind of questions. Balcony view is another way to think about that. Just getting some perspective on the larger form or structure of what you're looking at. And then thinking about relevance and audience. One thing we notice at the journal quite often is that the paper has been submitted direct from receiving feedback from the professor. This happens a lot. So it got a good mark. The professor may have even said, submit this to the journal. What needs to happen though first is you need to read it closely to consider how this is relevant to an outside audience and relevant to the larger research or the larger or existing studies around it, more robust sort of literature review than what happened typically in an undergraduate class before presenting information or even original information. And you also need to translate it for an audience that doesn't know anything about it and situate it in scholarly conversation, but also, talking to your mom, like, why should she care about this? It's kind of like a wider audience needs to care about what you're writing about. There's beautiful examples for some of the really complex information that's communicated in the scientific world. In the journal Nature, the writing is really good. So if you go through, you can kind of read it and see those spots where it's been translated for a wider audience really beautifully. All right. So for example, if you did this as an assignment, so we all have a vivid understanding of why education around vaccines is critically important. We know that now, having been through a pandemic. But pre-pandemic, would we have cared about this? Maybe not as much, right? So communicating significance, communicating why this is important in the world. Why should anybody out there care beyond a public health professional why this is important? That needs to be explained within a project such as this. Okay, so for those outside the discipline, have somebody read your paper. The Writing Center is a great place to get that kind of feedback. What were the snags? Like, where did they get lost in what you wrote? Sometimes it happens very early on in the paper, and so that can be really interesting. So something that we call reporters' questions, or I call reporters' questions, the who, what, when, where, how. Usually we attend to all of the answers to all of those questions, especially the what, like what you did or what you're saying is there. But going a step further and saying, so what? Why should people care? And then I've already said that. So here's another example. So you've examined the efficacy of MCT oil ketogenic diet on children with drug-resistant epilepsy. That research shows promise for children using the MCT oil as a supplement on a ketogenic diet. Why should any of us care? So some of us here might know something about epilepsy. Some of us here might know something about ketogenic diet. Some of us here might know something about MCT oil, but bringing it together, right? Maybe some of us know nothing about any of these things, or very little. So why should the average person care? So you might explain that epilepsy is a very common neurologic condition in children. There was an interview by Dr. There's a doctor, a neurologist at the College of Medicine, and the podcast is really interesting because he situated it by saying people don't realize how profoundly this affects families, how epilepsy not only affects the child's quality of life, but the entire family system. And so he stated the importance of why we should care about this. And he did a study. He was talking about a study he did with children and cannabis on drug-resistant epilepsy. So you might talk about that. And MCT oil. So ketogenic diet would be a diet that's been used for almost 100 years for people with epilepsy to control seizures. And it's not, a lot of people aren't candidates for it, but for drug-resistant epilepsy, they might try that. So that is great, but ketogenic diets are very hard to follow. They're extremely high fat, and to have a child avoid sugar and carbohydrates and eat a very high fat diet is, children can be really, really picky. They don't want to eat what they don't want to eat. So MCT oil is flavorless, easy to access, and can be supplement hidden in a smoothie and that kind of thing. So now this is more interesting. Now we have more background. I said it in a very conversational way. You might formalize what I just said in a way that makes it more interesting for an outside audience. You might also, for revising for a broader audience, this is for my colleague Jill McMillan. I did a screenshot of her workshop, and we have this online. I'll provide a link for it as well. You can see her little face in the corner of the screenshot from her online presentation. She has a very good presentation on revising introduction. So the introduction is obviously that critical point where you're making this interesting for an outside audience and making it clear for an outside audience. So here she shows how a strong topic sentence leads into an introduction where you have that frame of reference for understanding the paragraph content. That one sentence does a lot of things. It introduces the topic, provides the context, provides the time frame, and provides the geographic context, all within that first sentence. So first sentence or two, getting all of that information packed in for the abstract and the introduction is important. Let's see if there are any questions. Great. So next on the list of higher order concerns, if people don't understand what you're saying and you're oftentimes it's because you're not being concise. There are other reasons why you're not being clear. They're not going to understand what it is you're saying. They're not going to stay awake, essentially. They're not going to be interested in what you're saying. either. So it's important to revise for clarity and conciseness. There are certainly many publications out there where the writing is not clear or concise, and it's been published. Would that work get cited as much? Probably not. So these are my 6 tips that I have for making your writing more clear and concise. The first one is to use the old new information pattern. So here's an example of the old new information pattern, a paragraph not using the old new information pattern. So what you'll notice is at the beginning of each sentence, we have new information. So when the reader starts the new sentence, they're now taken somewhere else, then taken somewhere else, and they're a little bit disoriented. And if you've experienced reading this kind of work, you have that feeling of reading back and reading forward, and then what was that again, and reading back and reading forward. So you can improve that phenomenon by putting things in closer proximity and using different types of repetition. Now, our instinct is to not do this because we're told not to repeat ourselves. And it ties into that whole idea of conciseness. We don't want to be wordy. So repetition makes us more wordy. But there is good repetition as well. There's bad repetition and there's good repetition. Here's an example of just direct repetition. There are other ways to do this where you're not being as repetitive, and I have an example after this one, but this is just, for the sake of illustration. So at the end of the first sentence, we try to provide optimal growing conditions for crops by using soil additives to adjust soil pH. Okay, person's taken that in. One way to raise the pH of the soil, so you can see the difference between that and this. So in this one, garden lime is mentioned toward the end of the sentence, and agricultural limestone toward the end of the sentence, whereas here it's mentioned at the beginning of the sentence, which is, again, disorienting, and so you don't have those links in the chain. And at the end of the next sentence, we have the new information, so we flipped it around. And then you repeat that information at the beginning of the next sentence, and then you can add new information at the end of the next sentence. Now, this seems very formulaic and robotic. You really do have to pay attention to what the context is and the meaning of what it is you're writing. In this particular case, we can just do that. The person has just done that straight repetition. Here's another example. This is from Canadian Historical Review, from an article by L.C. Leddy. And their topic, the beginning of the sentence is the subject of the sentence. It's what the sentence is about. So biofortification is a balanced, economical, and sustainable approach to reduce nutritional deficiencies globally. Biofortification of pulse crops, including pea. So here we have biofortification used twice as the subject of the sentence in order to create that greater proximity. So this is less tight a proximity as the previous example, but it's still better than number 2, where we have biofortification mentioned early and then not till the end of the next sentence. So, and again, you don't have to do this every time, but where you're struggling, you don't want to keep using a transitional expression like in addition or furthermore. You can overuse those transitional expressions, or conjunctive adverbs they're called. You can use bits of repetition in order to create that coherence. One trick for this as well, whenever you use this or these, oftentimes you'll see your professor saying, this what? So that's where you have to answer the question. So you can just describe what it is you just talked about. So you might find it in a verb. So here we have the word, at the beginning of this sentence, Skypes and Wilson found. Just change the verb found into a noun, this finding, in order to describe what it was you just talked about. So that's a tip for using repetition at the beginning of sentences in order to create that coherence. All right, any questions about that, please feel free to link in the chat, and I can send some more examples of that as well. I think it's one concept that I learned really late but made a huge difference in my writing, and I really love that one. Another one that can make a big difference, and many of us will do this instinctively, but if you find your writing is quite choppy and repetitive and you're always starting sentences in the same way, like you can string through a paragraph and go circle the beginnings of the sentences as this, 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 or Jones, 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 you're always starting sentences in the same way. They tend to be the same length. It can have a really unnatural feel. So that's why I put a picture of a branch, because it feels natural. It's got different lengths, different textures, and as human beings, are, when we're listening to music, literature, academic articles, having medium, short, long, length sentences and then different grammatical structures keeps our attention, and it feels more natural. It feels like there's a human being behind the writing. It's not about being creative, it's quite technical. So go through your paper and check the length of your sentences and the type. So in English, there are only 3 types of sentence. There's a simple sentence, like the dog jumped over the fence, right? There's a compound sentence where we add 2 of those together with something like an and. The dog jumped over the fence and the cat ran away. 2 sentences pushed together with an and or a but, something like that. And then we have a complex sentence where we show a relationship between those. It's a little bit more complicated with the subordinating conjunction. So when the dog jumped over the fence, the cat ran away. So we're introducing a subordinating conjunction when, in order to create a dependent relationship on those 2 kind of sentences, right? The first one is no longer a full sentence, but you've got those 2 what are called clauses. So I don't want to get into grammatical terminology. We do not have time for that. I would recommend taking a grammar workshop to learn more about identifying sentence types, because it's very powerful to know sentence types, not only how to punctuate, but also how to write more clearly and to create that natural rhythm with different sentence types. All right, so here's an example. All right, so here we have a simple sentence. Mira finds solace in reading. So the blue is, thanks Merle. The blue is the subject of the sentence, or the doer. And in English, it's a particular order. Not all languages are like that. So some languages, it's like the suffix of the word tells you how it's operating in a sentence, that kind of thing. But the order isn't as important, or the order is different, right? So in English, it's what is the sentence about, what is the action or the verb, and then everything else comes after that. So you answer all of the other questions after the subject and the verb. So who's doing it? So it's the doer, and then the action, and then the answers to all of the other questions. So what is Mira finding? She's finding solace in reading. In what? Reading. So who, what, when, where, how tends to get clustered at the end of a sentence. So we have a simple sentence that can answer all kinds of questions. And then a compound sentence is where you take 2 of those, subject, verb, object, doer, action, answers to questions, put together with a comma and a but, or a comma and an and, however you want to do that. The parts of speech are called coordinating conjunctions, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so, spells out fanboys. And then the other one, I gave you an example earlier of when the dog jumped over the fence, the cat ran away. Here we have another subordinating conjunction to make a complex sentence. So we have, although Mira finds solace in reading, her children interrupt her often. So we still have those 2 core sentences, but we've now added although, and sometimes that'll come in the middle of the sentence. Mira finds solace in reading, although her children interrupt her often. So that is punctuation implications, but it's also taking shorter sentences and combining them, or longer sentences and splitting them apart to create a more natural rhythm, and to give the reader a bit of breathing room, just to create clearer relationships between things, because you can see that and although those show relationships in a way that transitions don't. Here's an example from Nature magazine, or the Nature Journal. So the first one here, because this is the subject of the sentence, subjective socioeconomic status, verb depends. So here we have a complex sentence. So it starts with the subordinating conjunction, because, and yes, you can start a sentence with because. I try not to, because everybody thinks it's wrong and I don't want them to judge me, but you can, as long as you follow it up with a full sentence, which is right here. Important variation could be masked in studies that have been conducted at relatively high levels of aggregation. that's a full sentence. So you've got that subordinating conjunction at the beginning, and then you take a full sentence after that subordinate clause. This sentence is a short, simple sentence. Our results, subject, verb, appear to what? Support this idea. And then the next one is also a simple sentence, and I've highlighted it in blue as well, or blue font. Our results are consistent across a range, ranging from the neighborhood level up to aggregation. Simple sentence. Simple sentences can be longer. It's not about length. And then the last one here is a compound sentence. So we've got a comma and. This is a transitional expression, not a subordinating conjunction. So this is an interesting subject because you're kind of backing your way in with a verb. So you've got using higher levels of aggregation as the subject, leads to is the verb. And I've just taken out some parenthetical statements here to highlight a compound sentence. So there's a nice rhythm there that is really less about length and more about relationship. Here's an example with length. So the first, it's kind of nice to have a first sentence that's punchy, wakes the reader up, gets them the information they need in a concise way right away, and then they can move on to the more technical information, which comes very quickly after the short first sentence. We have, I'm calling it a medium sentence because it has parenthetical statements. The orange sentence, I would say, is a longer sentence. Then we have a medium. Then we have two longs, and then we have another medium. So you can kind of, there's no formula of like always alternating 1, 2, 3. You just kind of think about where does a sentence naturally split apart? Where can I combine a sentence to create short, long, medium, to create a little bit more of a rhythm, and read it out loud so that you have that sense of the length of the sentences and whether a sentence is too long or you have too many short sentences creating that staccato, choppy effect in your writing. All right. Strategy, the next strategy is avoiding weak verbs and zombie nouns. So I would just recommend watching this little video by Helen Sword, who has a great book called The Writer's Diet. I'm always giving it away. I thought I had it in here, but I don't. So it's a great TED Ed talk that's animated that explains what a zombie noun is. They're called nominalizations, but zombie nouns is more fun. So look for words that have these endings. That's one way you can find them. And here's an example. So verbs are kind of like the engine of your sentence. They make it active, they make it go. And we often tend to pick really weak verbs like is, or all of the forms of to be, has, was. Just kind of sit there. They don't really do a lot. And so if we can take those nouns and that we use here, so for example, we say this has an effect on that. We read that all the time. It's grammatical, it's fine. But can we give this noun, promote it to a verb? This affects that, rather than this has an effect on that. Just energizes it a little bit more, makes it slightly more concise. The performance of the medication. The medication performed X. You can get straight to it and turn the noun performance into a verb or an action. So some more examples here. I'm gonna jump ahead. Unclear pronouns. So we kind of hinted at it when we talked about old new information patterns, but explain if you use this or that or these at the beginning of a sentence, say what it is that you're referring to. Otherwise, it's an unclear pronoun reference, it's called. Other pronouns are I, you, he, she, it, we, you, they. These are pronouns that if you see these at the beginning of a sentence, they're words that replace nouns. And so they're shorthand, like instead of saying Bob, 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 I'll say he, him, his. And maybe we know that I'm talking about Bob because I'm standing here pointing at Bob, but when you're writing, you need to say something like this man or he found. Make it clear if you're talking about two different men in the sentence that which he you're talking about. So I think we kind of know that one. But here we found a verb and we've turned it into a noun in order to create that transition. So they lose money, these losses. All right, so this is a list that I got from a professor in my undergrad. I had them look at my paper before I handed it in, and they read through a bit, and they said they took out a post-it note, and they wrote these words on the post-it note, and they said, put this on your computer monitor, which was a giant 1990s computer monitor, just post typewriter. And he said, search for these words in your draft, where you find them, think about whether you need them, and if you do, maybe think about whether you can cut them directly or revise the sentence to get rid of them. These are great words. We need these words, but sometimes they're symptoms of the problem of wordiness. So it's kind of like if you have a fever, that's a symptom, not the illness. So these are kind of like fever spots, and you're writing that. Ooh, the illness. What's the illness? Wordiness. All right. So here's an example of a symptom check. So this one has a lot of them. This is the young woman who was elected to be president by the group. Some of you might recognize passive voice there. So the doer of the action is not prioritized or placed first. It's the doer of the action is the group. They're put toward the end of the sentence. So that would be one way to really make things click into place. If you were to put the group at the beginning of the sentence, it would go clink, 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 and you actually lose a lot of that wordiness. You get rid of a lot of those words. So we can't just cut is, we can't just directly cut any of these except maybe to be, but we could do something like cut it in half. The group elected this young woman president or to be president. So we got rid of a fair number of them here. Here's another one where we have there are, who have, is, and it is, and who, and by. There are 25 students who have already expressed a desire to attend the program next summer. Oops. It is they and their parents who stand to gain the most by the government grant. There are, you can usually just cut 25 students, just start with that. 25 students have, you can cut who have because you've done the work of cutting their are. 25 students have already expressed a desire to attend the program next summer. Instead of it is, just say they. They and their parents stand to gain the most. Get rid of who, by the government grant. So we kept by, not a big deal. We made it much tighter and easier to read. This is a very common one that you'll see at the beginning of sentences. Check your work for that. I want to show you a strategy for diversifying your phrases and transitions. There's a great, we tend to have crutches, like you find you're always saying, however, in addition, like 40 different ways to say and, right? And as well as in addition. There's ways to show relationships with a bit more clarity and detail. So this is a great phrase bank of phrases that academics use. So they've kind of harvested typical phrases from papers, and they might give you a nice healthy list of ways to say what it is you want to say. So if you want to describe previously used research methods, this might kind of like get you unstuck in terms of thinking about a different way to say that if you're saying it all the time. Signaling transition. So these are grouped into categories. So say you're moving from one section to the next. Some of these are colloquial, so you really want to make sure that if your writing style isn't too conversational or colloquial, turning now to that might happen more in a presentation or in more informal text. So think about something more formal like this. So the first 5 or so are more conversational. So that's just a word of caution when you're using this resource. So you can see that they've done the larger categorizations above, and then the general language functions on the left column or left menu. University of Wisconsin has a pretty good guide for transitions between sections, paragraphs, and sentences. I put here in my speaking notes that there's a book called They Say, I Say by Gerald Graff and Kathy Birkenstein. It's a pretty popular book. You should be able to find a used copy or get one from the library. It also has some kind of boilerplate. Nobody teaches you this stuff. You kind of absorb it by reading a lot of papers, but nobody gives you the handbook of this is how academics say it. This is how they do it. Here's an example of, oh dang it, present from, how do I, is this what I do? No. Oh my God. What have I done? You might want to crop this part.
Can you go back? I'll just pause.
So here's an example of using, sorry. Here's an example of transition use for a method section. And this is from a paper on light-driven post-translational installation of reactive protein side chains. So you could see how the writer doesn't always use in addition. They're kind of, sometimes you're showing a process through time. So first, second, third, finally, then followed by afterwards, after what? The reaction. So think about ways to create that flow.
Liv, where it
Yeah,
says sharepoint.com wants to use your microphone, can you X that out?
there we go.
Awesome. Thank you.
I've got 3 bonus tips at the end, and these are just some extras that I don't want to talk about in too much detail. Tip, and Merle is a very experienced, published, award-winning author, and she knows you got to take breaks from your manuscript, come back to it when you're fresh. Even if you have a tight time frame, take an hour. If you have a longer time frame, take a day or 2, come back, and you'll see it with fresh eyes. You'll see it again. Revise is to see again, right? So take breaks, get away from the paper and the screen, come back to it, and things will pop out at you a little bit more. The other one is I use the analogy of looking under the hood. So we often read for content. So if you're thinking about a car, that car gets you from A to B, right? This article gives me this information that I need. You're not thinking about how that article is made or how that car is made, what makes it work. So if you have a paper and you're reading it, you're thinking, this paper is really bad. It's really confusing. I'm bored. I keep falling asleep. Why is it bad? Look at why it's bad. Think about, is it the, are they not linking sentences together in the ways that we talked about? Are the sentences too long? Are there just monotonous sentence lengths? Look at some of the strategies we talked about today and think about, why is this bad? Why is it bad? You want to do the same thing for good writing. If you read a great article, it's smooth, it's easy to get through. Definitely think about why it's good. So don't just read it for the content, think about why it's good. Finally, somebody already mentioned this, or agreed with me when I mentioned this, read it out loud. So read your drafts out loud. I would recommend two things about that. 3, actually. Read aloud to a person, even maybe a dog, just somebody. Think about an audience when you're reading it out loud. And just make little flags where, oh, that didn't quite make sense. They look confused. Maybe that sentence, I was talking for so long when I read that sentence, it's too long. You can also, instead of reading to a person, you could read out loud, take a hard pause wherever there's a period. So at the end of a sentence, just wait. Hear that sentence by itself, not in the context of the next sentence. And the third thing is to read backwards. So to remove context of the surrounding sentences and to look at sentences in isolation, you might do that to check for grammar, for example. Read through the paper backward, sentence by sentence. Oops. I'm so sorry. All right, so that's my final, those are my final tips. So just to review, might be overwhelming information, but remember that there are people out there to help you with this. So librarians, help with the research, help with finding publication forums, help with open access. We have copyright experts. We have Writing Help Center people. So there's me, and then there's a whole team of tutors who come from different disciplinary backgrounds, science, writing, philosophy, everywhere. And one-on-one help is going to be a great preparation for getting your manuscript ready. Read the existing literature that's out there, go to conferences, check out poster presentations, get advice from people who you're studying with, and use a citation manager. That's a whole other topic. Thanks, Humira. I'm glad you found it helpful.
One of the things that I've always noticed about getting started and kind of writing a journal article is actually just having the confidence to try. And it
Mhm.
doesn't really matter if you're, sort of a new undergraduate student and you're just thinking about this, or if you're a seasoned journal article writer, just to getting that confidence to think, okay, I actually have something to say, or I can frame it, in such a way that I can make this, what I'm doing into an article. There's some people have that skill and that confidence, and others it takes a little bit of work to get there. I like to see everybody try. So
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons why I love to have Liv come and talk about these sorts of things, because when you break it down, there's things to think about crafting that journal article. Leave. One of the things that I know every time that I go sit down to write a journal article is that I go to the journal that I want to submit it to, and I go through their requirements kind of with a fine tooth comb. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's some journals offer so much information and so much detail. For example, with the undergraduate research journal, trying to strike a balance between too much information and too little. So our publication submission preparation checklist is quite extensive. Try to include information as you go along. There's a publication agreement that might include language you don't know what it means. If there's anything you don't know how to um, translate from the submission guidelines, ask a mentor, or you can even just write to the journal itself and say, when you say this, what does that mean? So there might be language around copyright, that or legal statements, that kind of thing. Many journals have very little information, quite loose, quite open, and that might be a time where you want to look at what they published before and kind of backwards reverse engineer, like, okay, what are the requirements? Or you might even ask the journal itself, um, what are the things that you notice the most? What are the top? I don't. It'd be a great question to say, what are the top things mistakes authors make when they submit? What do they forget the most? For us, it's not anonymizing your Word document, so we have to go in and anonymize it. Not following formatting directions, not reading when they check off the list, ethics approval, making sure that you go through that list of requirements. And not all journals are going to give you that amount of information to know what to do. So, yeah,
Thanks
I
so
hope
much, Leave. If
the question.
anyone else has any questions, feel free to either pop them into the chat, or unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. This is an experienced journal editor right in front of your nose, so this is the time to ask questions. Actually, what I'm going to do, Leave, is that I'm going to stop the recording, but I will continue and we'll stay here for another few minutes and people can ask questions. But thank you very much for being with us today and to share all of your knowledge around journals with us and with the students in the SURE program.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having me.